Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Sam. This is a series where I am breaking down the book Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, which has become a talking point for our fat acceptance and fat liberation activists, especially when they like to claim that fat phobia is rooted in racism. As a history nerd, I decided I wanted to take a deep dive into this book, take a look at the historiography, the sources, and how it's laid out. And it's been both frustrating and fun, and I am ready to dive into part 3. Let's go. So even though this is part 3 of my series, we will be talking about part 2 in the book. Part 2 is titled Race, Weight, God, and Country. And in her introduction, she framed part 2 as a description of how body size became a sign of race, morality, and national identity during the 18th and 19th centuries. This is done in 4 chapters, which I will summarize for you here. I kid. But these chapters are pretty dense with a lot of weaving storylines, so what I'm going to do is summarize her argument and bring about the key points as I saw them in an attempt to keep it concise. So we'll start with chapter 3, titled The Rise of the Big Black Woman. She claims she will detail how philosophers and race scientists made the case for intellectual and physical differences between whites and the, quote, colored races. In this period, she says we see the earliest examples of learned men denigrating a so-called black fatness. To begin, she tells the stories of several philosophers like Bernier, George Louis Leclerc, and others who attempted to define races or categories of people. Bernier was the first to want to classify people, and he wanted to do so by physiology, but he still saw black people within the realm of beauty. George Leclerc, or Comte de Buffon, believed that all people were created from a single source, but also believed in racial differences. She explains he defined race as individuals within a species who procreate and whose offspring share their traits, which is not the definition of race that we have today. So I just wanted to put that in there and make that clear. She spends a lot of time on Leclerc, and within her passages, she shares that he did think that Moors were short and small, but described black Africans as tall, plump, but simple and stupid. After letting readers know this, she states by describing them as plump in their own subcategory here, Leclerc is defining it as a negative descriptor. She just spent nearly 80 pages talking about how plumpness was viewed as a good thing. And now suddenly she's saying it has a negative connotation with no citation and no sourcing and little to no evidence to follow it. This was confusing, and she offered no clarity on why there was a sudden shift in what plumpness meant. She later mentions that he also described Africans as plump, idle, and dumb, but still found them beautiful and well-made. He also believed, despite having never traveled to Africa, that their land was full of millet and abundant pasturage and green trees, which meant that they could stay well-nourished with no effort. I found this particularly interesting because as she works her way through part 2 to lead us up to part 3, which is about doctors and healthcare, she once again starts to mention that anti-fatness has nothing to do with health, which is a talking point that we're hearing a lot today. Additionally, in a point that I just made a little bit earlier, if Leclerc thought that plumpness was bad and it suddenly has this negative connotation that Strings has told us it has, why would he describe it as well-nourished? There's a juxtaposition in language there. I also found it a little interesting that she walks us through this entire chapter, gets to her point, and then immediately says, by the way, all the men I just talked about weren't actually trying to denigrate black people or oppress people. They were just trying to understand the world around them. She continues this trend by discussing Diderot and Le Romain, stating that Le Romain played an integral part in the narrative shift from making sense of the world to codifying Black people. Leigh-Romain's theories included language around gluttony, and one such theory expressed that the vice of gluttony was inherent to Black Africans' way of life. Here again, I was left feeling like she didn't fully expand upon this point, and she openly says that he didn't spend much of his time discussing Africans. So this was really the only point of evidence she had to use towards her point from his entire library of writings. Then she took a moment to remind us of her argument, stating that the codification of Black people was developed beside the slave trade and in combination with men of enlightenment viewing gluttony as evidence of low breeding. She provides no sourcing for this, and up until this point has yet to provide solid evidence or examples of enlightened men relating gluttony to low breeding. In the middle of chapter 3, she mentions that fatness was intrinsically linked to Blackness, but again, doesn't explain this statement or offer any sources. Prior to making this statement, Strings discusses two varying opinions on the African Hottentot women, with some men believing they were little, low, and foul, but some still describing them as rather lean than plump. So which is it? If there were differing opinions, why did she conclude that these theories led fatness to be intrinsically linked to Blackness? This line of reasoning leaves little to be desired. Now, to round out chapter 3, she discusses Sarah, an African slave who became an exhibition, almost like a curiosity or a freak show, and this is the woman that we see depicted on the cover of the book. She claims that Sarah, and the men who paraded her about, changed the association, and now all Black women were linked to fatness, and whiteness was linked to thinness. While she does walk us through how she ended up at this conclusion, the steps to get there, in my opinion, are not strong. She boils this generalized conclusion down to the fact that Sarah was billed as the standard of beauty as it relates to the Hottentots, where her owners claimed she was the African version of Venus. She then says that by making Sarah into a plump African Venus, she became the antithesis of the Venus de Medici, and therefore the antithesis of thinness. I hope you all stretch today because we are reaching hard. She also uses a description by the last man to have worked with Sarah, whose last name was Cuvier. Strings claims that Cuvier was clearly disgusted by Sarah's fatness. She also throws in an insult and claims that that had to do with his own self-hatred for gaining weight. How original, as if we haven't heard about self-hating fat people before.
See, it's very loud and clear to me, Kiana, that you have a deep hatred of fat people, and it probably stems from the self-loathing that you've never actually worked on.
I'm going to read what he wrote as she quotes it in her book. Her shape, describing Sarah, is all the more shocking because of the enormity of her hips and by the projection of her buttocks, which was larger than half a foot. He follows up to share that her knees were a little fat, but her shoulders and back were graceful, her arms were thin, and her stomach did not protrude excessively. Now, I think that her interpretation of what he wrote here is based upon her research, instead of the other way around. To me, this appears to be a man trying to make sense of what he was seeing, a medical malady or condition that he had never seen before, because Sarah wasn't like other fat people. He was noting that her fatness appeared to be limited to her butt, hips, and thighs. This that he's describing, and what we see pictured on the cover of the book, sounds like lipedema, which may not have been a common sight or even something that was diagnosed back then. When Strings concluded that he was clearly disgusted, I had to disagree because we have seen other examples of harsher language when men do describe something that they find disgusting. Also, he still described her features as having grace. He seemed more perplexed about her proportions, which to me doesn't read disgust or even ill contempt, but rather curiosity. The only other reason that I believe her argument to be weak here is that she is literally blaming one woman for the entirety of Africanity being linked to fatness, while there were still learned men describing African women as lean and within the realm of what they deemed beauty. The two just don't align, and making a broad generalization like this is an example of a faulty generalization. You can't make a generalization this broad off of one example. This is not how it works in any historical research or analysis. In chapter 4, she sets out to explain the developing relationship between Protestant Christian identity and self-abnegation, which is self-denial or self-sacrifice. She argues again, at the same time as fatness and gluttony were being linked to African women, values of delicacy and slim physiques were becoming associated with English women by the arbiters of taste and the purveyors of morality. For the record, the arbiters of taste she discusses here are English men, but she never really discusses men or bodily preferences that exist outside of England. Once again, making her conclusion based off only these opinions. Another part of her argument that just really got me was this quote. She argues, "As eating and drinking less became evidence of refinement, so too did the thinner figures such behavior produces." So you agree, eating and drinking less makes you thinner. Who'da thunk it? Sorry, I haven't gotten sassy in these videos because I'm trying to keep it on topic and within the realm of objectivity, but it made me chuckle that even within something that fat acceptance and fat liberation folks are touting all over the internet, it literally says in black and white text that eating less and drinking less produces thinner bodies. Alright, anyway. After breaking into her argument, she begins to evidence them once again with biographies of doctors and philosophers and, more interestingly, magazines. First, she discusses Shine, who is a doctor who is trying to grow his practice and patient list by rubbing elbows in a tavern. He was overeating and overdrinking while building his client base and ended up collapsing from weight-related illness, therefore losing the clients he had worked so hard to achieve. Shine ended up looking to God and began eating a more temperate diet, a diet consisting mostly of milk, and he ended up losing weight. Again, who'd have thought? Strings tells this story to illustrate the beginning of diet culture, because Shine was able to rebuild his client base based upon this weight loss, and he was suddenly treated as a guru or a priest of weight management. And she goes on to mention that most of his clientele were women, pinpointing a few connections he had with high-class women. What she conveniently leaves out is that women were often the leaders of temperance movements because they were told they were responsible for their husbands' and sons' health. And men were the primary market for taverns. Could it have been that women were going to Shine, a man who had lost weight and changed his life, to discuss how they might achieve this for their own husbands? It's just a theory I had, but one that I was surprised was not explored at all. Strings might refute me by stating that one woman whose letters were cited in the book was taking the advice for herself. But I would counter that that does not mean that all the women were doing so. And I think that I can state that confidently based on a source that she will cite later. So you'll hear that here in just a few minutes. My interest in this chapter was most piqued by her citation of periodical materials. The first is a publication called The Spectator, in which fat white men would receive health advice about losing weight and temperate eating and drinking. She combines this example with a group called the Ugly Club, who had published similar materials, and then concludes that all of England felt this way because it was in their periodicals, which is already problematic. But then she also shares that the periodicals only ran for 2 years, which means it wasn't widely supported, and therefore undermines the argument she had for how the majority of people felt when it seems likely that this magazine did not have widespread support. She then goes on to introduce Joseph Spence and tell the story of his work titled Credo, where he ranked beauty hierarchically and scores women's beauty, with plump women ranking the lowest. After a long and winding explanation, she concludes that he also didn't like women to be too thin either. So once again, she says that they preferred average-sized women. Literally Goldilocks. Not too big, not too small, just right. Near the end of this chapter, I honestly started to feel like Strings lost the plot a little bit. She introduces Lady Mary Wortley Montague and makes a shoddy connection to Shine because of Lady Mary's milk diet. But she admits that there isn't a way to know if they actually knew one another or had ever talked before. The purpose of mentioning Lady Mary was that she wrote about her travels to Turkey, where she described how Turkish women ate too much. To me, it's hard to use Lady Mary as a source to know how much Turkish women actually consumed. Strings offers no evidence that they did in fact overeat, as fat folks would today. And if you think about the fact that Lady Mary was on a diet consisting almost entirely of milk, any amount of food is going to seem like too much food. And it's worth noting that Lady Mary still described Turkish women as beautiful despite their overeating. I also started to question her mix of sourcing, claiming that Englishmen were the arbiters of taste and were calling for English women to be svelte and temperate, while in America, where they were not the arbiters of taste, they were also described as svelte, while European women were described as plump or fat. It appears at different points that her sources actually conflict with one another on whether or not England is where her supposed fetish for svelteness originated. And finally in this chapter, Strings introduces Thomas Gainsborough, who painted thin women. She used Gainsborough's paintings to argue that the representation of thinness in his art meant that it was more mainstream. Here again, I was scratching my head because she admits that it's unclear if he was accurately painting the women he saw or if he was taking artistic liberty and making them appear thinner than they were. She also includes illustrations in her book of larger women that he drew, once again undermining her argument that he was leading thinness into the mainstream with his paintings. Now that our heads are spinning, let's get into Chapter 5, which she titled American Beauty, the Slender Aesthetic. String states this is where she will focus on showing how Anglo-Saxon women in the US adopted ideals surrounding eating developed in the 18th century England, where strict diet and slimness will come to convey religious enlightenment and racial uplift. And when I read this, honestly, all I could think about were how many other religious elements have periods of fasting or restricting their diets. This is not at all unique to Americans or even to white people. It's another overlooked point and unanswered question. In this chapter, she focuses much of her time on women and how they perpetuated thinness. She begins with Sarah Buell, who edited the periodical titled Godey's Ladies' Book, which she explains is like The Spectator, but for women. She uses an example of an article where the author is promoting men's dieting regimens and expresses that this is out of place because the audience was mostly women. But prior to telling us this, in earlier pages, she discusses articles that let women know that it was their role to regulate their husbands. Well, since the women of the time were cooking and buying the household groceries, and society's gender norms called for them to be responsible for their husband's diet, wouldn't that make it why an article about men's diet regimens would be in this magazine? I think if we just put the pieces of the puzzle together, it's less confusing than Strings makes it out to be. She also makes a few points about magazines being peddled to women during this period, which also isn't unique or out of place. Most women were home all day, so if a traveling salesperson came to their door, that's who they were talking to and selling to. Sales ads were also heavily targeted to women for this reason, And that is why we saw ads about making their lives and routines easier when it came to marketing appliances and cleaning tools. So at some point in her weaving storyline, we learn that Sarah gets married and becomes Sarah Hale. She moves on to discuss that Sarah was not the first to publish on health, God, or the pursuit of happiness, but goes on to say she was the first to tell Anglo-Saxon women how to prove their racial superiority. She goes on a meandering little tale about Thomas Carlyle and Ralph Waldo Emerson without making solid connections before reconnecting back to Hale. She argues that Godey's Lady's Book was widespread in its change regarding religious and racial identities as they related to thinness. I noted a question about relying so heavily on one source once again to make such a broad generalization. She also never mentions any data that might support this. How long was Godey's in print? How widespread was it really? She then moves on to discuss Harper's Bazaar magazine, where she cites an article that she says upholds Anglo-Saxon supremacy, which she hasn't really evidenced prior to this point. The author of this source says, "It would be hard to establish any standard of beauty for the whole world and call it fixed. What is held to be beauty by the most intellectual and refined of the world must be nearer the real article than anything accepted by a lower order of beings." Now, I'm not going to deny that it sure sounds like this woman believes that there are people of lower status. She literally says that. What I find interesting is that she appears to be appealing to men who, remember, are the arbiters of taste, to not set unrealistic body standards for women. Because don't forget, men were the ones traveling the world and actively trying to create a standard of beauty. Strings has already walked us through this. If men traveled to Turkey, where women were often shorter or rounder, and decided that that was the new beauty ideal, how would tall, average-sized women in England compare? This only showed me that women have been fighting unrealistic body standards since the dawn of time, but it definitely wasn't unique to any class of people. And I'm just going to throw in here one small note that annoyed me on the next page where she's quoting an author and String says, "Rather than this author being an ally or an empathizer, she denigrates fatness." I've said it before and I'll say it again, you cannot apply words and phrases that we use today to history. It's literally not the same. And it's kind of unacceptable in a historiography. So I'm just going to throw that out there. It really irritated me. Now it's irritated you. You're welcome. And just when you thought we were done, we get to my favorite chapter. Chapter 6. Thinness as American Exceptionalism. Remember just a bit ago when I said that Strings wasn't really discussing how widespread Godey's book was? I also wrote a little note to myself saying that I can't imagine what it would be like to see an author in 100 years look at Cosmopolitan magazine and decide that all women believed and followed everything they read in Cosmo. Can you just think for a second about how ridiculous that would be? Well, 2 pages later, Strings cited Cosmo. I wish I was kidding. Strings discusses Cosmo's history, where it started as a magazine focused on cooking, home decor, and fashion. The magazine nearly failed, and so they started selling stories like Godey's. My God, it's almost as if drama sells. She explains that the editor, Elizabeth Bisland, published articles in the periodical that praised Northern and Western Europeans. She also states that she is surprised Bisland would have inserted herself into this style of commentary because she later published pieces in other magazines decrying the sole focus on women's beauty, calling on men to also acknowledge women's intellectual and moral contributions. And I don't see why Strings would be surprised by this. Bisland was a woman working for a magazine owned by a man and driven by profit. Women during this time frame could not be outspoken and likely published a number of pieces that they didn't fully agree with. And Bislin proves it by having written this piece in her own voice, under her own name, in a different magazine. Just think about that for a second. It wasn't a time period where women had power in their roles, and we can't think about it in today's context where a woman could do those things. It's almost like I needed her to take just one more minute to put the pieces together. She then takes a giant leap to say that if women's magazines were promoting the connections between race, weight, and God, then by the 20th century, so were mainstream and academic newspapers. Now, this seemed backwards to me. She basically insinuates that because women's magazines were covering these topics, they were also being picked up by newspapers and other reputable sources. She might have had me if she had said this the other way around, but I'm not convinced that any scholar was out there reading a woman's magazine and then extrapolating their talking points. That just seems asinine. I also noted for myself that she casually referenced eugenics again before launching into a history of restricted immigration policies in the US against Eastern and Southern Europeans. She pinpoints 3 men who published or promoted eugenics via curbing breeding amongst undesirable folks. There seems to be a trend here, because again, she's quoted 3 people. Out of how many? How many scholars existed at this point in time? Because I'm sure it's more than 3, and 3 was in no way, shape, or form a majority. Using 3 people to argue that eugenics was widespread follows her trend of faulty generalizations. And once again, just really blew my mind. Like, what are we doing here? Near the end of this chapter, she begins to note that in 1923, scales to weigh people were becoming widespread. Her description kind of sounds like a horror movie. This section reads, "The reference to the scale here is significant. Starting in 1891, public weighing scales started to appear in shops and busy commercial districts. By 1913, scales made their entry into private homes. For the first time in history, weight-conscious Americans could quantify their thinness and their corpulence." Honestly, how silly does that sound? I couldn't help myself. I had to add the horror music to it, because this made me chuckle. She mentions that scales were originally created much earlier, in 1891, but never mentions why they were originally created or why they were problematic now, but not any earlier than that. But I understood she was teeing us up for part 3, where she is going to really dig in at doctors. We're going to be in for a treat in the next one. So for the moment you've all been waiting for, my conclusion. In my opinion, part 2 of this book did not at any point connect thinness to race, morality, or religion. It just did not happen. And honestly, what I heard was a lot of droning on and on and on about how white people hated other fat white people. Like, it was equal opportunity hate for fat all around. It didn't matter if it was on a white person, didn't matter if it was on a black person. People just did not like people being fat. So the connection to race has been lost in the plot. There was also a lot of people with eating disorders, such as Lady Mary, judging people who didn't have eating disorders, which is also something that happens today, but there's no proof whether or not the people she was judging were eating an average diet or not. I'll also add, I find it quite perplexing that her entire overarching argument hinges on the linking of fatness to blackness by the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, and yet she's completely ignored that portion of her argument. And I want to be clear here. I'm not in any way disregarding the horrors of slavery or its long-term damage, right? We're still seeing the effects of that today. But it seems like she couldn't make the connection or found making that connection too difficult, so she just ignored it completely, which has just thrown me for a loop, because there were so many points at which she could have talked about the different generations of slavery, which is some thoroughly conducted research by Ira Berlin, who's a wonderful historian in this field. But again, she just didn't do that. So makes me think that maybe that's a pretty weak connection to her overall book topic. I'm also just really struggling with the fact that Strings is a sociologist, but at every turn, she ignores sociology in the story. Like, she doesn't take even a split second to think about why people might have been acting the way that they were, the forces that were around them, that could have been making them act the way they were. I'm talking wars, rations, sieges, slavery, which is in her argument. There are so many things that could fully explain the story, and she just completely ignores them. She took such a narrowed focus that her overarching argument has been lost. And so again, I just find that baffling as I continue to make my way through this book. And what I will note is that I would have been so interested to read more about the doctor, Dr. Shine, who lost weight and then ended up being treated like a guru for weight loss. Because I do think that she made some valid points to the religious roots of diet culture. And the way that diet culture and specific regimens of eating are almost treated like religions. I mean, people get really militaristic about the way that they eat, from people who follow keto to the vegan diet. Like, you don't cross them. It is a way of life, and they have their gurus. Like, I would have been way more interested to read more about that, and it made me have so many more questions. And it would have been really relevant. So maybe someone will pick up on that, having read this book, because that is certainly something that I would be interested in learning more about. Alas, we are stuck with this book that has yet to support at least one part of its two-part argument. So there's that. All right. Thank you so much for watching today. I will see you in the next one. Bye.